Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Winning an all-expenses-paid trip without any catches is quite rare from my experience. There's something unfamiliar with awards, triumphs, and real success for most adults. Take winning the lottery, for instance. How much money does a person sink into that abyss of no return just to win a free couple of lines in the next draw? When you add it up, gambling and gambling addicts are just trying to break even. Even in my experience, and I'm no expert, I've found it nearly impossible. But as fate would have it, profiting or balancing the account when it came to sweepstakes, contests, or raffles hardly produced a stroke of fortune. Another example might be the old office pool, where everyone puts some money in during something like the NCAA Sweet 16 basketball tournament, and then by chance, only one person in the office wins or loses, according to who in the end is crowned the champs of college basketball season. Sweet 16. Now, there is a phrase as un-PC in our current climate and things you can say and do, but you get my point, right? Well, now, there's always the exception and the exclusion, of course, in that somebody always wins. What's the slogan? If you don't play, you cannot win, or gotta be in it to win it? Mark Sweeney was literally over the moon. Life had been a crapshoot for him. He'd never won a single thing in his entire life. The main cause of never winning is he never gambled. He wouldn't even bet on a sure thing, yet this one time, he filled out a sweepstakes form online to win an all-exclusive paid trip to a marvelous holiday resort, and he had won. Most certainly the luck of the draw, as they say. He couldn't be more thrilled. Plus, he had plenty of accumulated annual leave time built up from work that he could take it. The company he worked for had already sent out a notice to all employees to take their annual leave before Christmas if at all possible. They didn't want the leave to build up from weeks to months. Mark put in for his holidays at work, which were immediately approved, and he told no one what his plans were. He simply said, I'm going to be away for a couple of weeks, so I'll see you when I see you. The trip to this holiday destination began with a flight on a 757 jet directly to the Vail Eagle Airport, where a car rental was waiting for him in his name. Mark thought, this is too good to be true. He hadn't won the Megabucks lottery, but he had won, and this was going to be, more than likely, a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. He paid a little extra and upgraded the vehicle to a sportier model. He was informed that it shouldn't take more than 30 minutes to make the drive from the airport to Beaver Creek. All he needed to do was head east on I-70. All loaded up and situated in his rental, off he drove. He rolled down the window to breathe that fresh mountain air of Colorado. It was clean, refreshing, and he sucked it in like therapy. His flight had gotten in late, and the sun was sinking like a ship. Not bothered by the lack of sunlight, Mark decided to jump off the interstate and ended up on Highway 6, which was a bit closer to Eagle River. He was glad this trip was happening before snow season. He wasn't experienced with winter driving. The sports car Mark had rented was quite zippy, and he was having a great time flinging himself around the curves and sharp corners. Of course, he should have known better, but he wasn't considering the risk of throwing the dice, and his driving was becoming foolhardy at best. He loved the feel of this car, the way it stayed glued to the road. He was now drifting as if the traffic laws didn't apply to him, and never considered once that there might be a state police or sheriff's deputy just waiting for some reckless nitwit barreling through injudiciously with acute hubristic instincts. Mark was really laying into this unfamiliar, sinuous stretch of road. Tires were howling as he flew into the sharpest bend yet. Mark realized the instant he was in the tightest twist of the road that the traction beneath him wasn't holding. Matter of fact, it gave way at an unreasonable speed. The car, with Mark strapped tightly in it, did a tumble, a rollover, flipping more than 3 times. The squawking tires sang no more, but Mark was filling the car with his own screams. There was severe momentum where metal and plastic were folded and bent, and Mark was captured helplessly in the twilight of the moment. The ragdoll being tossed down a flight of stairs, Mark's arms flailed in a twisted and perverted show of animation, as he was contorted in natural ways, completely at the mercy of Newton's law of motion. Force equals newtons equals pounds equals tons. He told himself, "This is gonna hurt." The car ceased its violent tumble and miraculously landed right side up. The car was munted, absolutely demolished. Mark heard a hissing sound coming from steam pouring from the radiator, and the horn seemed to be stuck in muffled klaxon mode, as if something was covering it. Mark unfastened his seatbelt, crawled from the window of the demolished metal. He did a once-over, palpitating his body, searching for anything broken, but as fate would have it, he was in one piece and surprisingly not hurt at all. He picked up one of the door mirrors that had broken in the crash and examined his face. There was not a scratch or even an abrasion to be found. He immediately thanked God for coming through this unscathed. "Hallelujah!" he shouted out loud. "What a stroke of luck!" he thought as he searched for his cell phone. This was just great. Not lucky enough. He could not see his phone anywhere. Smashing the rental car was going to raise his automobile insurance rate, and now his cell phone was missing. After a disappointing search, he decided, since he was losing daylight, to grab a bag of essentials and head back up to the road, hoping to hitch a ride from a passerby, and he could return in the morning daylight to locate his phone. His bag was fairly heavy, and he found himself struggling along the road without a single car in sight. He watched carefully for a sign of a pair of headlights heading his way. He didn't care from which direction they came, he just wanted off the road. He walked a good way and was about to take a seat on his luggage when up ahead in the distance he saw a light. "Saved," he vocalized, just realizing how scratchy his throat was. He was now desperate for something to drink. This tickling sensation in the back of his throat caused him a slight cough, but he proceeded on being drawn to the light. The house appeared to have a single window lit up, which was evidence of a possible resident being home. As he drew nearer to the house, he took note of how shabby, dilapidated, and run down the place presented itself. A cold chill raced over him, as if winter had breathed upon him. He knew before night plunged completely into darkness that he needed shelter, and regardless of the miserable state of the house, he had to take a chance, one more time to tempt fate. He hoped the turn of events, meaning the car accident, and him surviving it without a scratch, was not his last miracle of the night. Mark stepped onto the wooden porch. The flooring felt soft, rotted, and spongy. He rapped a few solid bangs on the door with his knuckles and waited in anticipation of being greeted. He heard the stirring of someone inside responding. The door soon cracked open with a squeak. A young boy answered the door. He was in his pajamas. Mark guessed his age to be 11 or 12 years old. Mark had expected an adult, but the boy would do. "Good evening, young fella. My name's Mark Sweeney, and I've been in an automobile accident. Would you happen to have a telephone I might use to call for a taxi?" Mark asked. The homely boy with the red tousled hair stood dumbly, eyes fixed queerly upon Mark's face. "Ain't got no phone, mister." The boy obviously had learning disabilities, Mark assumed, and he asked further, "Is your mother or father home that I might speak to one of them, and possibly giving me a ride to Beaver Creek?" The boy looked stiff, sadly lethargic. His nail beds were grimy and black, as if he had just recently clawed his way out of a grave. He answered with, "Ain't got no mother or father, but I had a ma and pa, and they're both dead." This troubled Mark deeply. For whatever reason, his stomach churned like a maelstrom and cramped as if he had suddenly been punched in the gut. Being submerged in this uncomfortable position, with Mark knowing that the boy could not possibly live here alone, asked, Is there anyone else here that might help me? Do you happen to know of any adult who has a car and can drive? Mark glanced around at the driveway, not realizing until now there was no car in the drive. He swore under his breath, trying to mentally fight off the stomach cramps. My sister? I live here with my sister, but she's not here right now, the boy said drearily. Mark introduced himself a second time. I'm Mark. What's your name? I'm called Buck. Again, this apathetic child was either missing a few marbles in the social category or he was on some really good opiates. Hey, Buck, how about you let me go to the toilet? If you would be so kind. I'm really not comfortable with going out there in the woods, Mark said. Sure thing. You might not want to be outside tonight anyhow. Inclement weather is moving in, the weatherman said. Buck opened the door back further, and the unoiled, rusty hinges sang with a note of rapid oscillation similar to that of a minuet. Inside the house, with the door closed behind them, Mark found himself in some kind of throwback to early civilization. The room was amazingly spacious, which amplified the clumping of Mark's boots, resounding with reverberations echoing from floor to ceiling. Nice acoustics. Mark took note of the taxidermy, which he had a degree of aversion to. Mark was an animal lover, and this didn't sit right with him, though he was grateful for the hospitality. The other peculiar thing was there was no electricity that he could discern. The room was lit with a few candles, which were burning bright and guttering down, plus one lamp, which Buck had retrieved from a ceiling hook and was now using as the guide down a hallway where the toilet was found. Mark was over the moon to be out of the harsh elements. Buck handed him the lantern without a word and left Mark to conduct his business. As he stood over the toilet, attempting to relieve himself, he realized he no longer needed to go. He noticed a fair bit of dust and cobwebs, as if this toilet area was seldom, if ever, used or cleaned once in a while. He was glad he had minimal light. If the house was such a ruin in the dark, he could only imagine what the illumination would reveal. He gave up on the attempt to empty his bladder. As a matter of fact, his stomach came around as well, and he soon proceeded back into the main room where Buck was dutifully standing. You wouldn't happen to have a phone, would you? Mark queried again. Got no use for a phone, ain't nobody to call. Mark thought it inexplicable that a house would have no way of communicating but to each other. So, Buck, is there a power shortage, or have you guys had your electricity off? Mark inquired. Ain't no electricity in a good month of Sundays. One day we had it, next day nothing. We get by, though. One day you're living, and the next day you die. Ma and Pa both died, Buck somberly said. I don't mean to pry, but how did they die? Mark's curiosity of this backwoods scenario had risen to the surface. Before Buck answered, there was a meowing of a cat, and Mark looked down in the dim light of the shadowy floor and felt the brush of a cat against his ankle. Oh, you have a cat, Mark stated the obvious, surprised. It's Edith's cat, Buck informed him. Does it have a name? Mark reached down and stroked its soft fur as it purred, still circling his ankle. Yes, sir. That's Familiars, Buck answered. What an odd name, Mark thought. Then, on the other hand, the day had morphed into a peculiarity that caused him an uneasiness. There's something not right. The languor in the air he just couldn't describe. I don't know when Edith, my sister, is going to return. You ought to stay here tonight. You don't want to be out there at night. It ain't safe, Buck suggested. Are you saying that only you and your sister live here? Mark couldn't understand this unless Buck's sister was quite a bit older than him. His car wreck was now pushed far back into his mind. He wanted to know more about how these siblings were living. Well, we dwell here. It's home for us. Buck's eyes were still as vacant as when he first opened the door. Mark couldn't get a read on his kid. Mark thought about asking the boy for something to eat or drink, but strangely his thirst and hunger weren't anything he believed he needed to satisfy right away. My bedroom is down the hallway across from Edith's. I would let you sleep in Ma and Pa's room, but Edith said we needed not to disturb it and to keep it as it is. I could offer you our couch, Buck proffered. "Oh, sure, thank you. The couch is fine. I'll be gone early in the morning. I'll find a ride then. Maybe Edith will be home by then and she can give me a lift," Mark communicated. "Oh, Edith don't drive," Mark said as he walked awkwardly down the hallway to his bedroom, where he entered and closed the door without another word. Mark was truly perplexed. A weird little fella, he thought. Mark didn't bother to get undressed. He'd carried with him a sheet for a bed. The thoughts of laying on sheets hundreds of people had slept on had given him the heebie-jeebies. He stretched out the clean white sheet across the couch and laid down, hoping sleep and morning would come quickly. His eyelids were tired because of the hours spent wide awake, but the slumber left him as he wrestled with so many uncertainties in his mind, unable to resolve the perturbations that distracted his rest. His mind was very much active, and he spent a good while in rumination with intractable thoughts. The ascendancy of how the rich had it all and the poor had nothing caused him to remain awake for some time. He thought he was just about to doze off when he heard something that startled him into a posture of fright. He listened intently to identify what it was he had heard. There it was again, like something scooting or sliding, shuffling toward the back of the house. He thought better than to wake Buck, who he assumed was surely asleep by now. He decided to investigate this anomaly. After all, Buck was a child in this house, and some lunatic might be trying to break in and take advantage. Mark grabbed the lantern and made haste, getting to the kitchen, where he found the back door open. Was it possible someone had already entered the house? He cautiously went to the door and stretched the light out in front of him to see more clearly into the dark. There were impressions in the grass from the door, as if something heavy had been dragged away. The grass, obviously, and recently had been mashed down by something of impressive weight. Mark saw nothing within the light's limitations, and made the determination it would be foolish to venture out on such a chilly night. Buck wasn't wrong. Inclement weather had moved in. It felt like snow, but there was enough moisture in the air that possibly rain might be on its way. Mark returned to the sofa, where his mind's overactive thoughts refused him sleep. It then dawned on him he should check on Buck, for what if someone had entered the house? He hurried down the hallway to Buck's bedroom and found the door closed. He staved off any trepidation by reminding himself that Buck was just a boy and was too vulnerable not to peek in to see how he was doing. There was a light beneath the door that he could see. The radiance was red-tinted glow, which troubled Mark slightly. Red. He thought about desisting, but he knew the right thing to do was to open the door just a crack. It was not his intention to maliciously spy or disturb his sleep or even invade his privacy. It was important to make sure Buck was in no danger. Mark clutched the doorknob in his hand and with some effort twisted it and gently pushed on the door, laying his shoulder against it. Deathly cold air forced its way out, accosting Mark's face. His eyes instantly teared as the frigid temperature of Buck's room escaped. What Mark saw was an unexplainable mockery of all that was holy. The unhallowed scene was far worse to Mark's senses than the rush of cold air was. In the ensuing few seconds, Mark's idea of good and evil took on new definitions. Atrociously dripping from the ceiling were pools of blood that clung upside down and rained over the bed where Buck was lying. He was partially sitting up with his head tilted slightly toward the nasty serum massacre above him. Mark shuddered, unable to mentally process this debauchery of mad bloodlust and sheer sadism. Mark could see his arms reaching down from these unnatural ponds of crimson. Buck sat up, his eyes gleaming as blood drizzled, covering him. He squinted to see, and his blandishment, he spoke directly to Mark. "Now that you see, do you believe?" Mark stood halfway between the door and the frame, with one foot still in the hallway. Fearful of his life, he refused the answer of this demon child and backed out of the abysmal room. He closed the door, but furtive whispers had followed. From inside the room, Buck laughed a demonic guffawing and deliberate cackle of horrid vocal accents with such intentional intensity the disdain of his denunciation caused Mark to put his feet in motion. His only concern was to escape this hellish carnal house and its eldritch wickedness. Quickly gathering his belongings while keeping an eye on the hallway, he was convinced he wasn't being followed. Instead of using the front door, he was drawn to the back door for a reason he couldn't explain. In this conscious decision, he felt detached from his body, although he remained self-aware. Mark raced to the back door, which led into a wooded area. He couldn't convince himself to head back to the road. He had an urging inside to conceal himself and to hide out of sight. He hoped his gamble would pay off. As he stepped through the door into the outside, he heard Buck's voice scream out maniacally, "The dead have gone before us! The dead have gone before us!" Although Mark noticed the same imprint of drag marks in the nearly frozen grass, he recognized the need to distance himself from this living nightmare. Into the woods he disappeared with a lantern in his hand, full of oil to guide the way. The darkness was indescribable. The light barely pierced through the dark, inky eeriness. As he eked through the wooded area, the trees became more sparse as he walked, until he emerged upon a road. He didn't recognize his surroundings whatsoever. Being lost was the least of his worries after the gruesome sight he beheld in the house. There was no explanation. He was thankful to have made it out of there alive. He decided to walk east on the edge of the road and pray to God someone would come by and collect him from this hostile, windy environment. As it began to slightly sleep, Mark, keeping to the road in full forward motion, observed a light in the distance. It was a house. It was far too dark to make out what sort of structure it actually was. As he moved closer, he recognized the place. It was Buck's house. This was hilariously ironic, he thought. Had he gone in a full circle? How in the name of all things righteous and holy could this be? Maybe it was just another ramshackle house that had a similar appearance. After all, he didn't take mental notes of the exterior of Buck's house. He had no other choice but to risk it. The slate was pelting him like needles, and he was frozen to the core. He stepped up the familiar steps and, with hesitation, accompanied by misgivings, he knocked on the door. A female voice from inside called out, "Who's there? Can I help you?" Mark convinced himself this couldn't be the same house, or if it were, it would have been Buck who would have answered. "Oh, sweet Jesus, yes. I'm lost and frozen and have been in a terrible accident. I'm not injured, but I need to escape this weather," Mark pitifully answered. The door sang as it opened, with its strained, corroded hinges, creaking a conversant melody of syncopation that pierced Mark's ears almost painfully. The demure face of a beautiful young woman greeted him with a wavering smile of welcome, dressed in a long white sleeping gown. Her crystal blue eyes were unblinking, and she was immune to the cold from the churlish, unforgiving outdoor elements. "Please, won't you come in? You must be frozen." Mark did not delay. He needed warmth immediately. He did not find it inside the house, however, for it was identical to Buck's house. Lit with candles and lanterns, and as cold as the grave, he realized he'd stepped back inside the sinister chamber of horrors. "I am Edith," she politely said, with a mischievously distinguished smile. Mark wondered, should I say anything about Buck? Did she know that I was in the house earlier and bore witness to her demonic brother in some sort of satanic ritual? He opted not to share his name and hold out to daylight before attempting an escape. He would die in this unfavorable weather. Edith seemed genial and pleasant enough, so without invitation, Mark sat on the very sofa he'd attempted to sleep earlier. "Can I get you something to eat or drink?" she said pliantly. "No, thank you, just shelter. I only need to warm myself," Mark answered, being somewhat confounded at his own loss of appetite. He sensed another presence, and his heart thumped 3 quick succession poundings. His acute fear was somewhat relieved when he felt the rubbing of the cat against his ankle. Reassured somewhat, he rubbed the soft fur and it began to purr. This is familiar. She's a good cat. Edith shared. Mark almost said, I know, but remembered he needed to play it cool as if he had never been there before. Would you have the time? Mark had no clue what time of night it was. Time? Edith suddenly appeared incoherent, which raised Mark's alarm bells. She didn't answer. Mark decided to stick his neck out and asked, Do you live here alone? Her face twisted somewhat uncertain, and in Mark's view, somewhat conjectural. As if fragments of memory were being fed into her head by an invisible force, she answered, I live here with my brother. Her tone was deadened as a gloom overtook the room. At that point, Mark understood they were not alone. Something unseen had seized the room and influenced Edith, removing the graduations of her mind and causing her to stand statuesque, expressionless, dulled, and fragile. Mark didn't see Buck, but as his imagination ran wild, feeding on the scraps of limited knowledge and the obvious, with great circumspect, he kept his eyes peeled as to not be taken off guard. Edith spoke much differently now. Gone was her innocent and vulnerable bashfulness. What she said next haunted Mark's soul. Death is summoned easily. Why would you say such a thing? Mark asked, still clutching a small luggage piece in his hand. Oh, I was referring to if you had remained outside in the storm, she answered. She added, You can stay here for the night if you wish. I would strongly advise it. May I use your toilet? Mark needed to make sure Buck was no longer in the house. For some unknown reason, he didn't feel Edith was a threat, but that boy Buck, he might be the evil devil incarnate. Holding a candle, Edith led Mark down the hallway past the door where he had encountered Buck, lost in macabre extravagance. In another door, further on the opposite side of the hallway, was a toilet. We have no electricity, as you can see. The storm is responsible, but the toilet flushes, she said, looking steadily into his eyes as if to read his mind. Her voice was colorless, with no defining character. Mark broke the gaze and said, Okay, then, I'll be right out. Edith's intentions were not known, but her methods were efficacious in that she was successful in causing a disconnect in Mark's thoughts to the point he wondered if any of this was real. He still had his power of observation, though he had lost faith in himself. He had little confidence because the idea of this house and its occupants were incomprehensible. Mark had no need to use the toilet. He merely needed to separate himself from Edith. He tried to bolster up his courage, for he felt deep down a crisis was imminent. Soon he would be immersed in terror-stricken fright of unsurmountable proportions and volume. As of this moment, the majority of his ambivalence was the invisible assailants he had invented himself. He found himself deeply steeped in inexplicable, self-generated, stifling fear. Is everything okay in there? Edith encountered with concern attached to her question. If there was only a window, he challenged himself against the frozen night. He fought back his emotions and blurted out, though from an undulation of a wounded cry, Yes, 1 minute, please. Mark collected himself, got his nerves together the best he could, and stepped out into the hallway. Did you flush? She unexpectedly asked with sententious overtones, as if he'd been accused of an indictable offense. Mark hurried back into the bathroom and flushed the toilet obediently. When he entered the hallway, Edith's countenance had become an infernal shade of infinite sorrow. Just when Mark thought he'd recovered himself and was able to be more recumbent with this seemingly endless, dire situation, Edith just had to go and appear as some malfeasant emanation of unearthly dread. Mark could not bear much more. Puerile and absurd, she flippantly asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" Offended, Mark responded, "What sort of question is that?" "I do," she said, with a vulgar, frivolous gesture of the hand. "I believe what I see," Mark answered. "Do you believe that nightmares are real?" she asked mawkishly. "Please, I don't know what you mean." Mark was confused, with fog permeating in his already clouded mind. "Mark, can you hear me?" Mark heard Buck's voice, but it was somehow in his own head. Edith asked, "Are you afraid of monsters?" Banality and despair drifted through to the ether of his soul. There was a sudden amalgamation, a uniting of something inside of him with something that seemed distant that was now looming over him. Mark could not concentrate. He saw Edith before him in an imbecilic exhibition, twirling and smiling and spinning and laughing. "Help me with this," Buck's voice necessitated in Mark's head. Mark heard the trill of many voices gibbering, but only saw Edith in some pathetic display of ridiculous improv dance. Mark found himself dragging something. He was unaware of how this heavy bag came into his tightened grip. He pulled with all of his might. Why was he pulling this bag? His thoughts were scrambled, and he was astounded with terror. He was on the grass, dragging a weighted sack toward the wooded area out back. "Pull harder! Pull harder!" Buck said as he backed into the thickets. It was a titanic mission, but he had managed the mysterious bag, and now he stood over it. What was it? What could it be? What was in the bag? He glanced around, and this was when he saw an open grave to his right. He was nearly on the edge of the damnable thing. Buck's voice spoke again. "Put the bag in the hole." Mark refused. This was outrageous, phenomenally unthinkable. He didn't know what was in the bag. He frantically began to tear at the ties which bound it close. Under the copse of trees, in frigid, relentless weather, standing next to a grave, Mark ripped the ties off and prowled into the bag as if he'd found treasure. But what he had discovered was no treasure. He found Ma and Pa charred, burnt to a crisp. It was his own Ma and Pa. Edith was heard laughing and scolding. "Look what you did, you freak. You've killed them. How are we going to live?" Mark felt the essence of who he was drifting away. Thoughts raced into his mind, pushing Mark Sweeney out and making him extinct. Every memory of Mark faded, and Buck's mind commenced to take hold in great and wondrous details. Mark fought back with what little he had remaining. He sprinted from the gravesite into the woods and ran like the devil until he was standing once again on the porch of the same haunted house. He didn't knock this time. He barged in maddeningly and went straight down the hallway. He burst through Buck's door. The room was empty. He went to the next room, which was Edith's bedroom, and in a violent rage he crashed through, leaving the door off its hinges and splintered. He was fed up. This deception had gone on long enough. Uncharacteristically, Mark screamed out an injunction. "Show yourselves! Where are you?" There was no answer. Mark stormed from the room straight to the last bedroom, which had been said to be the parents' bedroom. He froze at the door, knowing this was it. He had no more options and nothing to lose. Taking in a deep, stale breath, he exhaled slowly, and without resistance, he swung open the door. His eyes could not believe this perverse abomination before him. Buck was standing naked on the bed over his bound parents and was pouring what smelled like gasoline over their bound bodies. The odor of benzene engulfed the room. The parents were still. Mark assumed he had already murdered them. Edith stood to the side of the bed with a large lit candle in her hands. She had a fierce fire in her eyes and ignored Mark altogether. She cited something aloud. If only darkness had taken that night away. May it not appear among the days of the year. May it never be entered in any of the months. Behold, may that night be barren. May no joyful voice come into it. May it be cursed by those who curse the day, those prepared to rouse Leviathan. May its morning stars grow dark. May it wait in vain for daylight. May it not see the breaking of dawn. For that night did not shut the doors of the womb to hide the sorrow from my eyes. Buck turned his blood-soaked body toward Mark and said, You're not the one." Yowling as if he were in great pain, the demented boy leaped from the bed and charged Mark, shoving him with terrific force from the room and slamming the door with a loud lock of the key. Mark had been pushed to the floor and was now viewing the room under the slight crack at the bottom of the door. Flames lit with a whoosh sound, and Mark could see the bed had been set ablaze. Leaping to his feet, he touched the doorknob with his hand. The heat had already made the knob impossible to grip. Mark ran again, this time not through the kitchen, out the back, but straight out the front door. He'd witnessed the most unfathomable experience, the deplorable, the unbelievable. As he fled the ghastly house and its devilish illusions, the sun was coming up over the horizon. When the sun lit his face, he never felt more alive. He continued to run until he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching behind him. He stopped and waved his arms, hoping the driver would stop and give him a lift. The heavy oppression he'd been afflicted with had lifted, and he was as light as a feather. The van slowed and then pulled over to the side of the road. It was an older couple, from what he could see. It stopped right before reaching him, and he approached with jubilation. He went to the passenger side, where a couple in their 50s sat smiling at him. "You need a ride, fella?" The man seemed friendly enough. "Yes, please. I've been through a horrendous ordeal and haven't slept all night," Mark said thankfully. "We just live up the road. You can use our phone up there to get yourself help and be on your way," the man said again, gracious enough. "Slide the door open and get in. The door sticks a little, so yank it hard," the woman advised. Mark took the handle by his hand and gave the door an aggressive pull. The door was difficult, but sprung open. Because of the van's tinted windows, the occupants sitting in the back seat had not been noticed by Mark. Before his bedazzled eyes sat Buck and Edith, grinning with wide-stretched, unnaturally shaped mouths that were more like slits across their face. "You kids scoot over and give this man some room," the mom said, staring straight ahead. "You believe in ghosts now, Mark?" Edith asked. Buck moved over from Mark and said, "Once you're a ghost, you can't go back. Can you, Pa?" The driver never turned around. He simply replied, "That's right, son. Dead is dead." Mark climbed into the van and slid the door shut. Familiars leapt onto his lap and purred quietly.
Chilling tales for dark nights.